Hey everyone. So today we're going to touch on two things. First one is going to be around deploying Veeam backup and replication from the Microsoft Azure marketplace. I've done a lot about the flexibility around deployment and want to continue that here because there's a big use case or a strong use case for things like disaster recovery, but also being able to access that backup data that you've potentially sent into the public cloud, whether in this instance, whether you've sent it to Microsoft Azure Blob Storage or whether you've sent it to AWS S3, having that VBR server there in the public cloud will give you some benefits. The second part of the video will be, or the demo will be touching on a comparison between V10, as you'll see here on this Excel spreadsheet, where we compared some scenarios about where we restored virtual machines and their backups, where we restored them from using different proxies and different backup locations, whether it uses our capacity tier, which is from S3 or from Azure Blob Storage or any S3 compatible, whether we use the dedupe device, local direct attached storage, but then also where the actual Veeam backup and replication server also resided. And you can see from version 10, our results stated that this was the quickest way, closely followed by being able to do it locally from local fast direct attached storage. So 5.5 minutes is our time to beat. You can already see down here, so V10A, so an update release came out a couple of weeks ago, and you can see already that I've performed those tests of on-premises, and they're now compared to those version 10 results here. And you can see that in a lot of places we're getting almost half the benefit, half the performance, half the time of exactly the same machine. Now I've used a very small machine, but purely for test purposes. It will give you a good idea about what that now looks like. So what we want to do is we're going to deploy the Azure Veeam backup and replication from the marketplace. We're then going to run the test, and I'll speed this up so we're not waiting those 2-3 minutes. We're going to test using the Azure proxy within Azure, and we're also going to run the test where we're just ultimately using the local VBR server to perform that test, which was the quickest one before. So I'm expecting to see some performance and some time savings there as well. So let's get into it. Let's jump straight into our Azure portal. Okay, so what have we created before we start? And you don't need to because the wizard allows you to do that, but I've created a public IP address so that I can use that to access my VBR instance. And I've created a resource group as well that you can't see here, but I've created a resource group that I'm going to use. So if we then jump in and we do a search on the marketplace for Veeam, I've touched on this a few times because we've used this quite a few times in some of our deployments. We've got Veeam PN, we've got our service provider console, we've got this is new, I've never used this before, so running through this next. Veeam Cloud Connect for service providers, to get our service providers up and running, to be able to offer a service out to their customers. We've got the Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure free edition, as well as the Bring Your Own License. We've covered this in detail when that was first launched. And then also covered is the Veeam Backup for Microsoft Office 365. Final one to mention, and I think we're going to do something around this, because I don't think we do enough, or we don't speak about this enough, but many enterprises look to use or look to manage their systems and services within their company, very much like a service provider. The Veeam service provider console gives you access to that multi-tenancy way of being able to manage and look after your tenants. In the same fashion, that can be very much leveraged by the enterprise or larger businesses, disparate distributed environments. So we'll probably touch on that in a later video and walkthrough. So I'm going to choose Veeam Backup and Replication version 10. Let's create a virtual machine. So again, as I said, I already created a VBR resource pool, or resource group, sorry. Virtual machine name, so I'm going to call this CADE VBR. just for ease. I'm going to leave it in the East US availability options. I'm not too bothered about it. It's just going to be for demo purposes. Okay, so what do we want this to look like in terms of size? Now, by default, this is going to select a pretty meaty machine, but if you look at what this does, and if it's not running all the time, then it doesn't necessarily matter too much either. But I want to make sure that it's got the spec and the capability of being able to run these restore functions that we have. Again, this won't last too long, but I can have this powered down, not consuming any CPU or memory, which means it won't be that $237 per month. So then let's give it a username and a password. Oh, hang on. Let's find something that's a little bit more, or a little bit longer. Okay, do you already have the Windows Server license? We're going to say no in this instance, but obviously if you've got, then you bring. Where do we want the OS to sit? I want it to just sit on the defaults, the premium SSD, whatever the requirements or whatever the best practice is from this deployment that we as Veeam has already deployed out. So I want to also give it that public IP that I mentioned. It's going to create its own virtual network because I don't have a network group. Obviously, if you did, you could do that. Same as security groups and virtual networks. I don't need to load balance anything. I'm going to leave the defaults here as well. I'm going to enable that auto shutdown because I don't want to spend that amount of money. Any advanced extensions to install, any host groups, no and no. Any tags, now this is useful if you're deploying stuff that you want to then be protected, potentially using Veeam Backup for AWS and then bring that VBR server back home or into a vSphere environment, or maybe even move it to AWS. It gives us that flexibility of being able to move that. So, and then with that, I'm then going to go off and create that. It shouldn't take too long, and then we can go through, configure that, and start the testing in terms of being able to restore from that. And I'm not sure whether this image itself, which is another good reason why we're running this, is this running version 10, which was released at the beginning of 2020, or is it running the A release? And if it's running the 10, the dot release, if you like, of the GA version, then we'll go through that upgrade process, because one of the things to mention is our community edition already has that 10A update release process already built in, and 10A we basically wait for a large number of our customers to download, install, use, understand, and find out if there's any issues within there. Obviously, it's gone through our own QA process, but once that gets to a certain threshold, I think we're at 20,000 at the moment. Once that gets to a certain threshold, then that will automatically be seeded into the automatic update process. So for those customers that wait for that process before they update, then it will wait for that as well. Okay, so that deployment takes around 5 minutes, and then if we minimize that and we jump into, I'd already created a RDP with those credentials and that IP address, so we should be in. Okay, so when you first log in, it's going to ask, well, have you got your license file for Veeam Backup and Replication? Now, depending on what you're using this VBR server for, will dictate as to, well, one, whether you need a license file or not. So in this instance, I'm not actually going to be backing up anything. So I'm okay with this just being the community edition, which will allow me to back up, in theory, up to 10 instances. But I could also, in this instance, I could actually use the Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure and use 10 instances there to back up maybe Azure VMs. This isn't really going to be doing any of that work in terms of backup. So if we just say, if you don't have a license file, just click Next, Software Operating Community Edition, which gives us all the recovery functionality. There's loads of content out there around that. So license agreement, things like the evaluator's guide, etc. are all options there. So when we jump into this, we're going to have a freshly built VBR server. Now, Veeam, and I've touched on this many a time during these deployment videos, is that Veeam isn't a difficult or long-winded approach of being able, or hard or difficult way of deploying software. But there's lots of different options as to how you deploy that software, whether you're using just the next, whether you're using something like Chocolatey as a package manager for Windows, whether you're using Terraform to build out your whole virtual machine infrastructure with a Veeam server plus dynamic proxies. Fine, absolutely all options. Or, as I say, it could just be the next. So now we've got it installed, and this is a very fast way. If you think 5 minutes, we're using an image, we're deploying it from the marketplace, we've now got a machine up and running, and we can start adding our object storage or importing our backups into this VBR server to then start restoring that workload or those workloads, maybe as Azure VMs. Let's say maybe not a full disaster has happened in your on-premises site, but let's say a number of vSphere hosts have died. Now, what this gives us the ability to do is take some of those workloads and restore them as images within Azure, and that's the whole premise of direct restore to Microsoft Azure or AWS. So what we've got here is we've got now a fresh copy of Veeam Backup Replication using the Community Edition, but that's absolutely fine because we're not protecting any workloads. And you can see, okay, I've got my default backup repository, but I don't have anything in there. So what we're going to do next is we're going to add in our Azure blob storage into our VBR. Okay, so now we need to add in our Microsoft Azure blob storage. So if we add in object storage, Microsoft Azure blob storage, Azure blob storage, and then this is where we, and the key point to this, and so we can add through the UI or we can add through PowerShell. So if you've got a number of different maybe blob storage accounts or storage accounts within Azure that contain Veeam backups, because that's the way you're using the capacity tier feature, then obviously you would need to add them all in. And the specific point here is that they all have to be exactly the same as what they were before. So I think it's that. We'll see. We choose our region. We can choose a following gateway server if we wish, depending on what you need to access the. Okay, so that's a good start, is that we've found our container. We're going to find a Veeam folder within here, and we'll leave all of the other settings exactly as they were when they were or how they are on premises, and having them both set up is absolutely fine. So we're still we've got our on-premises VBR server, and we're still sending data to this Azure blob storage, this particular container within the storage account within Azure. Okay, and then next up we need to add that compute account so that we can actually take advantage of that direct restore to Microsoft Azure. So the Azure blob storage, the storage account that we just added, is where all of our backups reside and they live. Now we need to add in our compute account. So if we jump up here, manage cloud credentials, add, and then Microsoft Azure compute account, Microsoft Azure global, create new account, configure account. This should open a web page that then allows us to authenticate. So if I use this, may or may not ask me to, yeah. And then possibly MFA. So I'll do that on my phone. And then we should import that as your subscription configuration, which then gives us the best of both worlds. So we're adding this. Now, obviously, that's a little bit long-winded. You can obviously do this, as I mentioned before, you can do this through PowerShell if you've already got that configured or got the script. There's scripts on Veeam Hub that enable you to do that. Okay, so we're good. So next, it knows that I've got 2 subscriptions there, one pay-as-you-go and one Visual Studio Professional. And there we have it. So, okay, so now we've got our storage account and we've got our computer account added. But if we jump in here, we still don't see any of our backups that are in that object storage. That's because we need to import them. So importing backups, metadata from object storage repository may take a while depending on the number of machines and restore points. Start the import process. Yes, please. This will then drag all of that metadata down, only the metadata. This isn't going to bring any of the information out of Azure or out of the blob storage locally. It's really just going to give us the visibility of what that metadata or what is it within that storage container. So we're gonna, there is not much in here at all, so it shouldn't in theory take very long at all. There we go. You can see that there's 1 out of 2, or there's 2 backups in there. There we go. The first one took 15 seconds. Obviously the mileage will vary depending on how much data you have residing in there, but this really shouldn't take too long. And then from here, and again, all of this, so that import process can be all part of that same PowerShell script that enables you to just, you get Veeam Backup Replication up and running. You then have the add in the backup or add in the Azure blob storage account and actually add the bucket, and then add the compute account. Import the backups from that Azure blob storage. All of this could be happening pretty seamlessly and pretty quick in the background. I just wanted to show you the process of what it looks like. Now if I go back into home, you'll see disks imported, object storage imported, and from here we'll see that machine that we want to actually directly restore back into to complete the testing that we previously started performing. So if you remember, there's 2 tests that I want to run here. So the VBR server sits in Azure, and we don't use any proxy within Microsoft Azure, and there's one where we do want to use the proxy. So we come through here, and I've done, again, many videos on how this looks. H2S. This is where we configure either use Azure proxy VM or not. So for the first test, I'm not going to. We choose the VM size that we wish to use. We choose the storage account that we want that to be in. And I'm making these consistent across all of my tests. So they're all going to the same place, the same resource groups, etc. Same networks, same network security groups. Oh. We're not performing any scans. We are not powering on at the end of that. Okay, so you've just seen that complete. So 4 minutes 42 seconds for that to complete that direct restore from that blob storage using this VBR server as the proxy or the data mover and the conversion, and restoring that into an Azure virtual machine. So you obviously saw that quickly because you probably didn't want to sit there for 4 minutes and 42 seconds to understand that. So now the next test that I want to run through is actually leveraging an Azure proxy. Now, because this was a fresh install of Veeam VM replication, we didn't have an Azure proxy deployed in Azure. So I went off the demo and I went in and I created the Azure proxy. You run through this, and one of the benefits of 10A and why it's given us such a performance increase here and time reduction in time is because it's choosing the appropriate sized VM to be able to restore the machines in the best possible way. So really just go and deploy yourself a proxy. Again, I'm going to work on something so that all of I want to run through and show you the UI and how this works and how you could do this manually using the UI. I'm also going to probably do a follow-up video as well as release a script that will enable you to add and do all of this without having to manually go through the process in a like a manual one step at a time. The beauty of being able to use PowerShell or code for that matter means that we can do this concurrently whilst we're adding other areas of the process. So we've now got that Azure proxy. If we go back to home, we go back and find our machine that we want to test, restore. I'm not going to run through this again. What we'll do is I'll just show you the end result of using that Azure proxy as that. Okay, so we just finished that direct restore to Azure. I went through a couple of tests just to confirm, so that's why the time, for those that have paid attention to the time down in the bottom right hand corner and obviously the start and end time, I've tweaked a few of the I've tested various different ways of being able to do this, keeping it the same as what I've done for the other tests, obviously to make it fair. But I think the key point here is this number, so 738. If we jump back down into the comparison and we jot that in there, I think this is the important part, is that if we look at this column here, this shows what it was in VBR, so Veeam Backup Replication version 10, released at the very beginning of, or towards the beginning of 2020. And now we compare that to 10A, which was released, let's say July, August 2020. So 6, 7, 8 months after, into the year. And what I'm most amazed at is that, okay, we get to see whether we're using the Azure proxy and how much quicker that is. And if you go back to when you would use those restore scenarios and when you would use those proxies, is generally going to be because your bandwidth is potentially different. It's going to be based on being able to have the resources on premises to be able to do that, because you can see that on premises does make a lot of sense for some of these restore scenarios. But I think the biggest one is still the fastest. So the fastest in with 10 was 5 minutes 28 to get this machine converted into an Azure virtual machine. So it's still the quickest way of being able to do that, is deploy your VBR server in Azure, leverage the local system to be able to do that conversion process. But I think it's fair to say is that all of these are under that 10-minute mark, 9-minute mark actually, 8-minute mark. No, there is one under. But I think this really does open up a true door into disaster recovery, replication into using Veeam to get your workloads into Microsoft Azure. This would work pretty much the same for AWS. If you would actually like me to see and show you that from an AWS point of view, we can absolutely do that. Just comment in the description, in the comments below, and I'll get round to running a similar test there with the same workload, so you get to see the comparison there as well. But yeah, I think all I really wanted to do was update that from the video that I did around restore scenarios and when and when not to use a proxy here in that process of directly restoring. But yeah, anything you'd like to see in terms of this, I think this really does open up a door into disaster recovery, replication, that sort of angle towards leveraging the public cloud for doing more. Test and dev is a great example as well. And we've got some more. I'll follow up with an automation on how do we put all of that good stuff around the Azure Blob Storage, the accounts, etc. How do we add that using PowerShell? And we'll do a video on that. But then also, how can we then start to leverage this as more of a replication way, or being able to test our disaster recovery? How long would it take? And we'll take a tier 3 app or something and be able to walk through a scenario so that it's more relevant to workloads. But with that, cheers guys, thank you.